Um, Today we are studying from Daniel chapter 5. We've been studying the book of Daniel in our class here on Wednesday nights. We started this the beginning of January. We will continue this through the end of March, going just chapter by chapter, studying the book of Daniel. So today we're thinking about actually Daniel 5, but there's something that happens in Daniel 5. It's the writing on the wall. In fact, this is a pretty common phrase that sometimes you'll hear people say, well, the writing's on the wall. And this idea, this phrase actually comes from Daniel, whether people realize it or not. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. If you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and do so if you'd like to jump in and make a comment at some point. But I want to start with this quote from Wiersbe, where Wiersbe says this in his commentary, Be Resolute. He says, many people who know little or nothing about the Babylonians, Belshazzar's feast, or Daniel's prophecies use the phrase, the handwriting on the wall. The phrase comes from this chapter, from verse 5, and announces impending judgment. Belshazzar, his wives and concubines, and 1,000 notable guests were feasting and drinking while the army of the Medes and Persians waited at the city gates, ready to invade. The city of Babylon boasted that it was impregnable, that there was enough food stored away to feed the population for 20 years. But the Lord said that Babylon's time had come. And that's what we're going to read about here in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar was extremely arrogant, extremely prideful, didn't think there was any possibility that his powerful empire and kingdom could fall. But the Lord had something else to say about it, and we're going to consider that in our lesson. All right, let's take a look at Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, beginning. It says, Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines could drink out of them. And then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank out of them. They drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. That's interesting, isn't it? They praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, we know from other passages of Scripture that these are just material things, all right? And these material things that some people idolize, they're just material things. They're just things. They're just physical things. They're not gods at all. They can't do a single thing. And so it's interesting that while they're praising these gods of these material things, the real God steps in. And we're going to see that here in just a moment. The real God is going to show himself to Belshazzar and his companions. Now, let's think about this before we move forward, though. If you're a Jew and you are someone who admires the temple, in fact, because you're a captive Jew, you long to go back home to Jerusalem and be able to worship in the temple again. And yet you have been separated from the temple probably at this point for decades. Maybe some of the people who were captive Jews don't even remember the temple. Maybe they weren't even born in Jerusalem at this point. And yet you've been taught by your culture that respects the God of Israel and that respects the rights of the temple. You've been taught to respect the temple and its vessels and all of its things. You've been taught to respect the one true God. And here a king goes and gets the vessels that were originally used for your temple, drinking cups and other things like that. And he says, bring them here. Let's have a party. Let's booze it up with these vessels. How would you feel if you were a Jew and you saw something like that?
You'd have to feel violated, if they're doing that, and and not treating those vessels in the way that they were meant to be treated.
That's a good word, I think. Violated. You feel violated. Good word. Anybody else? Well, I think that's a good description. Feel free to jump in if you want to, but violated. You would be insulted. You would be angry because he'd gotten these vessels from the temple. In fact, we read about this in the first 2 verses of Daniel. It's noted that when he defeated Jerusalem, he also took home with him some of these things from these articles from the temple as kind of the rewards of war. And perhaps one of the reasons it's mentioned is because Daniel's going to come back to it when we get to Daniel chapter 5. All right, but you would be hurt. I would also suggest to you that God would be angry about this. This is not just an insult to the Jews. This is an insult to God. It's an affront to God that they are drinking alcohol and praising false gods out of vessels that are consecrated for the temple and the work that took place there. So here's what happens. Verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand emerged just out of nowhere and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now, these guys must have thought for a minute, maybe we've been drinking too much, right? We're starting to see things. But that's not what happened. They all begin to realize we're all seeing the same thing. This is real. There's a hand that's writing on the wall, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. And the king's face became pale. He might have been a little drunk at this point, but he's sensible enough to know that there's something unusual happening here. And he gets pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints loosened, and his knees began knocking together. Have you ever got that nervous, that scared, where you feel like your legs were going to give out? That's kind of what somebody might go through when they're going through a state of shock. I'm sure, actually, Ed, who's an EMT, right? You've probably seen people after they've been in accidents, and you've seen them in this type of situation.
Yeah, can't get up and walk, and a lot of things change in your body.
Yeah. And I think that's just what's going on here with Belshazzar. His knees are knocking, his hips are loosened, and he's in shock. He can't even stand. So the king called aloud to bring in his first group he's going to bring in. We've seen this before, haven't we? We saw this with Nebuchadnezzar twice. We saw it in Daniel 2 with the first dream Nebuchadnezzar had, but let's bring in the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. And some versions say conjurers, or some versions say magicians. But let's bring these people in first. Nebuchadnezzar tried that. He tried it in Daniel 2. He tried it in Daniel 4. Now we've got Belshazzar trying it here. And the king began speaking and said to the wise men of Babylon, anyone who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Shocker, right? We've already seen this story play out a couple of other times. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. Not only have I seen a hand, it's written something on the wall, but none of my wise men know what it means. So his face grew even more pale. His nobles were perplexed. So what happens here? I think it's pretty easy when we read it, right? He sees a hand, it's writing something on the wall, and the king reacts. He's in shock, he's scared, he's alarmed, he's perplexed. This has got his attention. It's kind of shocked him back into reality. Take a look at what McGuigan writes. He says, here he is one moment beating his chest, and the next he's beating his knees together. He shows off before his wives, his lords, and his concubines, and then he shows them what he really was. His joints were loose. That means he could hardly stand upright. And all he had seen was the part of a man's hand. What if he had seen the face of God? If such a tiny manifestation of God's power did so much, what of all of it? he just sees a little glimpse of God, and this guy is already shaken in his boots. This is impressive to think about. Well, notice who enters in. It says the queen entered the banquet hall. All right. And it's thought by most people that this queen would have been his mother. Perhaps it was Nebuchadnezzar's widow who was still perhaps alive. Doesn't say. So a lot of that is just conjecture. But the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. And the queen began to speak and said, "O king, live forever." By the way, it doesn't matter if you're the queen. The king had ultimate rule. And so you still had to respect the king, even if you were his mom. Okay, so she still speaks very respectfully, but she says, "Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father," now this sounds like someone who's speaking from experience. That's why most people would assume perhaps this is Nebuchadnezzar's widow. This is the queen mother, some versions say. So she seems to know something about Daniel and some of the things Daniel had done in the past that Belshazzar either wasn't aware of, had forgotten, or hadn't really paid attention. But she tells him, back in the day, there was a guy named in your kingdom who had the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. Now, this is pretty awesome, I think, here too, because even though this might be decades after the last time Daniel interpreted one of the king's dreams, she still remembers. And I think there's just a small lesson here, and that is when we do good things, when we sow seed, it might not be noticed immediately, but sometimes months and years and decades down the road, people will say, "You know what? I remember somebody who taught something or who said something or who did something that made a difference in my life. And now I'm going to use that experience for good." And that's what she's doing here. She remembers Daniel. He stuck out to her. And so he says, "Your father, the king, appointed him chief of the soothsayer, priests, sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation." So she comes to bring comfort. It doesn't seem like she's part of the partying group, but somehow perhaps she's heard the gasps and the cries and the worry, and she has come out to check and see what's going on. And she says, "Hey, there's somebody who can help you, and his name is Daniel." All right. So Daniel gets to be involved in the story because the queen mother remembers him. And that tells us something, I think, about the reputation of Daniel. He's got a positive reputation. Maybe Belshazzar was too arrogant to use him. Maybe Daniel was old at this point in time and was being relatively unused. We don't know. But Daniel was still known, still respected by the ones who remembered him. And I think this recommendation of Daniel can be a lesson to us that just keep doing good stuff. You never know when the seed is actually going to bloom in somebody's heart. It might take time. Just keep doing the right thing, and perhaps the impact will be seen years later, maybe even after we're gone. All right. One of the promises of the king to the one who interpreted the writing was that he would make the interpreter, I think this is a phrase we need to understand, he would make the interpreter the third ruler in the kingdom. Anybody do a little research on that? What does this mean? Why would he be the third ruler? If there's no guesses out there, and that's okay, let me show you some stuff.
Just seeing he would hold a high office is what all I found out.
Yeah. Well, certainly third ruler would be a high office, absolutely. if you'll take a look at the chart here, I've got to move a picture of us here. By the way, what you see over here is Nabonidus worshiping the moon, the sun, and Venus. This is something that's been found in archaeology. So clearly this is something that the kings did. And it's seen in archaeology. Moon, the moon, sun, actually, I think that's the sun, and Venus, that would be the moon. You can see the crescent in it. But you take a look at this chart here. You've got Nebuchadnezzar, who's reigning from the late, or I should say the early 600s BC. Nebuchadnezzar reigns for a very long period of time into almost into 560 BC. There's a lot of, after somebody rules for a long period of time like that, sometimes after they die and you're so accustomed to them ruling, there's a lot of shifting in the kingdom that's taking place. And we actually see that after Nebuchadnezzar dies. We have somebody named Evil Merodach who comes on the scene, and then eventually one of them dies, or their throne is usurped. And Nergal-Shar-Usur, I can't pronounce a lot of these names very well. Labashai-Marduk, notice, doesn't last very long. But then you have this individual named Nabonidus. Nabonidus becomes the ruler of the kingdom. Let me notice this next chart with you. Now, Kyle and Daelich, they have a really good commentary, but there's one knock against Kyle and Daelich commentary, and it's that it's old. And when they wrote their commentary a long time ago, there were certain archaeological facts and historical facts that they didn't know about. So this is actually something they say in their commentary that we're going to see is outdated. They say this narrative presents historical difficulties, for a Chaldean king by the name of Belshazzar is nowhere else mentioned. Okay, this is what they write in their commentary. We've never even heard of a Belshazzar. We only see it in the book of Daniel. And so they basically say that's really hard for us to understand. They say it does not appear to harmonize with the extra biblical information which we have regarding the destruction of the Chaldean kingdom. Because historically, at this point in time, when they wrote this, they hadn't heard of Belshazzar in history. Well, here's the problem. This is written in 1861. That's a long time ago, okay? And archaeology has uncovered a few things since then, and history has revealed a few things since then to help us realize, and I make this point, this is why I want this in here today. I make this point many times, and that is archaeology has never overturned a biblical statement. Archaeology tends to actually help confirm biblical statements. And this is an example of that, right? Take a look at some information here. In 1854, there was a clay tablet that was discovered. It was written at the command of Nabonidus, containing a prayer for long life and good health for him and his eldest son, Belshazzar. Archaeology confirms there's a Belshazzar. It also confirms there's a Nabonidus. And it shows us that Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. Take a look at this next statement. In the 6th century BC, parties of legal deeds would swear oaths by the gods and the king. And during the reign of Nabonidus, parties swore by Nabonidus and by Belshazzar. So what does Nabonidus make Belshazzar? He makes Belshazzar a co-ruler. They're both ruling Babylonia together for a period of time. And because of that, just one more quote here for you, Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar. So essentially there's co-rulers. And so the highest position that Daniel could be given was third ruler in the kingdom, because Nabonidus and Belshazzar were number 1 and number 2, right? And Belshazzar's authority was, because Nabonidus gave it to him, was seen as equal to Belshazzar's authority was seen equal to Nabonidus. All right. So that I hope that helps explain the third ruler statement that's made. And it's interesting how history and archaeology come together to help us confirm statements that are made in Scripture and understand them.
Hey,
All right.
Josh.
Yeah.
If you notice back in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar made Daniel, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect. I wonder if he would be the second ruler. That's why you have the third ruler.
Okay. Where was this in Daniel chapter 2?
Daniel 2, 48.
Yeah. In Daniel 2, though, that's when Nebuchadnezzar was ruling.
I thought
And
maybe it'd still be that second ruler by then.
Yeah.
Who knows?
yeah. So in Daniel chapter, what verse did you say that was in? 48. The king
Yeah.
promoted Daniel, gave him many great gifts. He made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Now, I want to mention something to you that's a good point, Phil, since you bring that up. But there were actually several provinces in the Babylonian kingdom. All right. And this was one of them. So it almost be like the United States of America, we have 50 states. It'd almost be like Daniel was placed over a particular state, almost like he became the governor of a particular state. There weren't nearly as many states in Babylon, but of course the province of Babylon would have been the chief province in the Babylonian Empire because it's where the capital was. And so it's a little bit different than him being elevated to third ruler. And this was perhaps 40 to 50 years prior to what we're reading in Daniel chapter 5. And that makes things difficult for us sometimes because we read Daniel 2 and we tend to think, well, Daniel 5, what was that? Just a few years later? It was actually decades later. People may have long forgotten about the position that Daniel was in. Some people suggest he might have resigned by then. He might have been finished with his rule by then. And here he comes and he's offered a promise from Belshazzar, and he receives it, as we're going to see here in a minute. So good thought. That's a good thought, Phil, and it's a good point to make. I don't think I even talked about that when we studied Daniel 2. All right. Then Daniel, verse 13 says, was brought in before the king, and the king began speaking and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I don't know how, by the way, Belshazzar was saying that. It almost sounds like when I read it, it sounds like he's being a little condescending. Are you the Daniel that, once used to be a slave? He says, now I've heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now, the wise men and the sorcerers were brought in before me to read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So he doubles down on his promise to Daniel, just like he did to all the other wise men. Then Daniel replied and said before the king, and I love this about Daniel. Daniel says, I don't care about your gifts or your rewards or your money. Essentially, that's what he says. Keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O King, the Most High God granted sovereignty, greatness, honor, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. Now, because of the greatness which he granted him, all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages trembled and feared in his presence. Whomever he wished, he killed. Whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated. Whomever he wished, he humbled. All right, so stop there for a minute. I just want you to notice a key phrase. All peoples feared in his presence. Okay? They feared Nebuchadnezzar, but I think perhaps the other idea is that they feared the God who gave Nebuchadnezzar power. What Belshazzar has just done by drinking out of the vessels shows a lack of fear for God. a lack of respect for the power and authority of God. And I think what Daniel is doing here is he's setting up a contrast. Your father feared God and respected the God who gave him power. And that's a little different than what we're going to see from Belshazzar. It says, though, even though your father feared God, he had a downfall because he had a prideful moment as well. And when his heart was arrogant and his spirit became so overbearing that he behaved presumptuously, he was deposed from his royal throne and his dignity was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind. This is what we studied last week. He was driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of animals. His dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he sets over it whomever he wishes. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel's making the point, Nebuchadnezzar needed to realize who's really in control. And it wasn't him. Who's really blessing him with his power? It wasn't him. It was God. And until he figured that out, he was humbled. And now it says, yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. It's almost like he's telling Belshazzar, actually, you're in a worse situation than Nebuchadnezzar was, because you know of the powerful God. Nebuchadnezzar wrote it down in a document and wanted the whole kingdom to hear it. And yet you still haven't humbled yourself to this God, and you have risen up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine out of them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified. That's a nice way of saying, Belshazzar, how dumb can you be? You have disrespected the God, the powerful God, who has already worked in this kingdom, and you're praising these made-up gods of gold, silver, and stone. He says they don't hear, they don't see, they don't understand. You've got it all backwards. And God's about to teach you a lesson, is what's going to happen here. So Belshazzar knew how God had worked before, at least according to Daniel, he did. The question that I want to ask is, even though Belshazzar knew about the danger of being prideful and not giving God the glory for any success that takes place in the kingdom, even though he knew that, did he learn that lesson himself? And of course, the answer is no. He didn't learn from history. He should have learned something from Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't. And there are times that people need history recounted to them so that they can avoid repeating mistakes. It's interesting, some of the same mistakes that our parents made or our grandparents made, sometimes we make, and we should be learning from their mistakes. Now, one of the lessons that we hear people talk about a lot in terms of our nation is that, we can look at other nations in history who have gone the same route that it seems like our nation is going with regards to morality, with regards to how the nation is run, with regards to socialism. You want to talk to somebody who's been through socialism? Talk to Marco and Lisette, who came here from Venezuela, leaving socialism, and tell me how it works. Ask them what they think about it. There are people out there who are begging others to see that we got to learn from history. We've got to learn from history. Some of the things that we see being done, they've been tried, and if we repeat them, we might just head for the same judgment. And we've got to also learn from Bible history for that reason. As Christians, we've got to learn from the good things that we see people from old times doing. We've got to learn from the bad things that we've seen people do. And we can't keep making the same mistakes in either our rejection of God, our ignorance of him. Paul said in the chat box, we look to history to prepare for the future. Absolutely. We should look to history to help prepare for the future because it can really teach us. But Belshazzar didn't do that. And he goes down a bad road here. All right. So a couple of quotes I'm going to share with you. This is from, again, Wearspeed. He says, it seems incredible that Belshazzar didn't know Daniel, one of the highest officers in Babylon, and certainly the wisest counselor in the empire. Belshazzar had been told about his grandfather's dreams and Daniel's interpretations, but too often young leaders are so concerned about themselves and the present, they forget to catch up on the past. Now, this is, the reason I'm including this quote is largely because of this last section, because it helps us mentally understand how many years have gone by. If Daniel was 16 when he was taken to Babylon in 605 BC, goes through his training for 3 years, that's about 602 BC, probably interpreted the first dream, 601, 602, okay? If he was 16 when he was first taken, and Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians in 539, which is what happens at the end of chapter 5 here. Then Daniel was 82 years old when Belshazzar summoned him to the banquet hall. Belshazzar needed to learn from this 82-year-old man. He needed to hear some stories from him. He needed to be consulting him long before the situation got to this point. And I think it's a great lesson for us. We need to listen to the elderly voices. We need to learn from their counsel and from their wisdom and from their experiences, because they might just have something to teach us. This is also what Homer Haley says in his commentary. He says, Daniel introduced his speech to Belshazzar by charging him with knowing the things relating to his father Nebuchadnezzar, and he was fully responsible for his irreverent and blasphemous conduct. He acted presumptuously in what he had done. He exalted himself in his own eyes and attempted to do the same in the eyes of those present. He demonstrated an arrogant contempt for the Most High God. And it was because of the king's disdain for God and all that is holy, the fingers of the hand had appeared. The fingers in writing came from God with a message from him. All right. So here's the message, verses 24 through 28. The hand was sent from him, and the inscription was written out. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the message. And I might be mispronouncing those words terribly. And if you know better, I welcome your correction. But mene, here's what Daniel says is the interpretation. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Okay? God has numbered your kingdom. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Essentially, the two words mean numbered and they mean weighed. You've been numbered and you've been weighed. And then the last word, Peres, notice that looks a lot like Persians. So some people suggest that Daniel has a double meaning here by using that word. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So what's the interpretation? God's numbered your kingdom. You've been weighed and you're lacking, and your kingdom's going to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, why is this chapter important for us as we study Daniel? Well, remember back to Daniel 2. There was a prophecy about a head of gold, and then there was going to be a chest and arms of silver that was going to replace that head of gold, and the head of gold was the Babylonian kingdom. And the chest and arms of silver was going to be a future kingdom that was going to replace this Babylonian kingdom. And what we see happening in Daniel chapter 5 is we see how that played out, when that happened, and more specifically, why it happened. Daniel tells us why it's happened, because you're arrogant and prideful, and God has decided it's time for your kingdom to end. God gave your kingdom success for a while. God can bring your kingdom down as well. And that's what he's going to do. And so when we think about what was meant, here's a different, kind of a different take on that. I just wanted to read this to you. This is from Alan Millard. He writes in Biblical Archaeology Review, He says this combination of names, of weights, could be compared to signs for dollars and cents written on a wall today. They're just inconsequential words, but he gives some definitions. Meany could mean 50 shekels. The fact that it's mentioned twice, meany could just mean counted, added, summed up. That's why it's repeated. You got tekel, which could also be reference to the shekel. Shekel was a form of weight and payment. Pires was half a shekel, so it's a fraction of a shekel. And so what you get from that is this. You have been summed up, you have been scaled, and now you're going to be split. Okay? Which I think is an interesting take. This is McGuigan, who just gives you another, somebody else is writing on this. He says, many means to number, tekel means to weigh, and uparsin means torn or divided. And so by God's help, Daniel with complete authority gives the message. Belshazzar is told, the days of his kingdom have been numbered, have run their course. He's been put on God's balance. He's been weighed. He's been found too light. And his kingdom will be torn apart by the Medes and Persians who are even now approaching at the gate. All right. That leads us to our last 3 verses of Daniel 5. And here it is. Belshazzar gave orders. This is the last official act of Belshazzar as the ruler of his kingdom. They clothed Daniel with purple, the color of royalty. They put a necklace of gold around his neck, indicating authority and power. And they issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as a third ruler in the kingdom. This is literally like the 5 minutes of fame here, okay? Because it's not going to last long. There's going to be a new kingdom that takes over. But thankfully, Daniel's going to have an influence on the next kingdom too, as we're going to see in Daniel 6. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So that same night, the very night he sees the handwriting on the wall, the very night Daniel tells him, you're about to lose your kingdom, that very same night he is slain. And Darius the Mede, the Medes and Persians take over. He receives the kingdom at about the age of 62. All right. So we have the Medo-Persian Empire taking over here. Just as Daniel 2 had predicted, we see it taking place in Daniel's own history. We see it also in extra biblical history. And Darius is specifically mentioned in verse 31. What are the lessons that we can learn from this? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 6 lessons for you. Number 1, remember Proverbs 31 verses 4 and 5? Proverbs 31 verses 4 and 5 says, it is not for kings to drink wine, O Lemuel. Take a look at verse 4. It says, nor for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. In the Old Testament, it was considered sinful for people who were leaders, people who were to be teaching the law and upholding the law, whether that be kings or priests or judges. It was considered wrong for them to drink intoxicating beverages. And we actually see the same thing in the New Testament. Elders are supposed to not be drinkers because that's just, it makes perfect sense when you read verse 4. Why? Because we don't think straight. And we're making decisions. We're doing things that we're going to be counseling other people. So we've got to have our mind straight at all times. And drinking wine corrupts that. We see that played out in the life of Belshazzar. He shouldn't have been drinking in the first place if he was familiar with God's will. Second point, our self-serving arrogance is only going to last a season before God's judgment. And him drinking this wine out of the vessels from the temple, that was very self-seeking. It was very prideful. He thought he was being the life of the party. He thought he was being funny. That's only going to last for a season. In Job 20, you can turn there if you want, but Zophar, actually, I know Zophar is not speaking by inspiration. There are things Zophar said that are wrong, but something he says in Job 20, I think we could apply to Belshazzar here in verses 4 and 5. He says this. He says, do you not know this of old, since man was placed on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment? It says, though his haughtiness mounts to the heavens, and his head reaches to the clouds. That's the idea of the big head, right? Yet he will perish forever like his own refuse. Now, he's saying this to Job, and he was wrong about Job. But we could say something like that to Belshazzar, couldn't we? He's haughty, he's arrogant, he's hypocritical, and it was only going to last for a moment. Third point, third lesson I think we can learn. One thing we learn from history is that sometimes we don't learn from history. We're supposed to be learning from history, but sometimes we don't. We repeat the same mistakes over and over. And I like this point that this is something Homer Haley mentions in his commentary. National sins bring national judgment. That's a little bit of a scary thought. National sins bring national judgment. We see that all throughout history for sure. We see the book of Proverbs speaking, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Something we mentioned about the Queen Mother is that our godly influence in a corrupt world can make an impression. Daniel is remembered by her and respectfully remembered. And we've got the same lesson today that we had last week as the final one. Pride comes before a fall. It happened with Nebuchadnezzar, happens with Belshazzar. So we've got to stay humble, teachable, correctable. That's the character that God wants from his people, and it's what Nebuchadnezzar becomes. We see him becoming that, but Belshazzar never has the second chance. All right, that's our lesson for today. We're going to get into Daniel chapter 6 next week. Are there any final thoughts, anything that you thought of that's a good teachable, preachable lesson that you'd like to share?